approach. And while I certainly agree that is the policy, it must be the policy moving forward, meaning strong strategic reassurance, but remaining open and transparent to Russia. What if that strategy doesn't work? What if, by strategically reassuring Central Europe and following the prescription that the defense minister mentioned, exercising, moving NATO infrastructure to Central Europe, training, what if that makes Moscow do some things or suggest some things that make the entire alliance be very concerned about that? Do we stop strategic reassurance because it will not make Russia happy? It may break off its partnership with NATO. And what happens if we try to be as open as we can to NATO and offer them new opportunities? There have certainly been suggestions of bringing or inviting NATO into Russia into NATO or doing some other things. But then, do we counterbalance the strategic reassurance? And if we try to do both and are unsuccessful with doing both, have we just not only reduced NATO's cohesion, but we have caused greater concern in Russia? We may have to think through a strategic choice if, and we hope this is not the case, if the dual approach is not successful. And I think as an alliance, we have to think through that scenario a little bit in the hopes that it won't be the case, but we have to be prepared if it is the case, because I'm not entirely convinced that we'll be able to manage both. And so that's a question that I offer for us to perhaps discuss in a moment. And finally, let me talk about enlargement. I think we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years that NATO has led enlargement and has led European integration. I would like to submit to you that I believe that NATO will not continue to lead it. I think it will be the European Union that will continue to lead integration. And that will be a very different proposition. My view, and working very closely from 2001 to 2005 with Central Europe and the Baltics, I saw the power of NATO working in tandem with the European Union that performed this transformation. The two needed to work together, but NATO was always in the lead, pushing, pushing, pushing. We've lost in NATO a strategic vision for enlargement. We've lost the strategic purpose of why. Because the blessing of enlargement, and I see it as a blessing, is that it's brought in wonderful energy, new dynamism to the alliance. Its potential curse has been, it is really hard to have a strategic conversation around the table when you have 28 people. I know, but I think I've heard enough stories that Secretary Gates sometimes gets a little frustrated because it's a long table to come around, and the very strength of NATO, which is consensus, is in fact its very weakness. So how do you have an effective conversation at this large number? And if we continue to grow and grow and grow without reform of the conversation, without reform of the structure, you start losing your way a little bit, I think, in enlargement. And what many people tell me is they point to, I think it's paragraph 23 of the Bucharest Summit communique, is that's our policy. If we're pointing to a paragraph in a communique, that's not a living embodiment of a strategy that we feel and understand, and everyone knows why we're doing this. So my suggestion is that NATO returns and thinks through the strategic path that it wants to see in enlargement in a future way. And I think that conversation is missing. Finally, I'd like to talk about partnerships. I'm certainly not an Asian specialist. I can't speak to a relationship with Japan or Australia, but I would like to point a speech that was largely missed. Secretary Gates gave a speech the same evening that he gave his speech to the Strategic Concept Seminar, and the headline that grabbed in the morning speech was the demilitarization of Europe in the 21st century. That was a headline stealer. But he gave a speech later that night, And I commend it to you because I think this is a way forward for NATO and looking at partnerships. What he was advocating for, he was bemoaning the fact that the United States has not had a very consistent policy towards security assistance and working with militaries around the world and establishing relationships, long-term relationships, that you develop these personal ties. And he was citing the fact of Pakistan, that we had severed those ties, and it was very difficult in rebuilding them when we needed them the most. And I thought and reflected upon NATO's work in Iraq, with the training mission, its work in Afghanistan and training, and I thought that would be one way for NATO to work so constructively with under a security partnership in the training. We build those ties, we build those relationships, we share values, and when a crisis is needed, that relationship is there. And that could be perhaps some of the best things that NATO could export, not necessarily the larger political relationship that some of these partnerships speak to, but the actual military-to-military relationship. And I leave that as a thought, and I thank you very much.